In the fall of 2022, a trail camera mounted on a fence post along an irrigation canal in Gem County, Idaho, captured an image that nobody in the wildlife management community expected to see. The image was clear, the timestamp was legible, the animal in the frame was unmistakable. A grizzly bear, an adult by the look of its shoulder mass and the pronounced hump that distinguishes the species at a glance, was walking through a landscape of agricultural fields and riparian scrub roughly 30 miles east of the Oregon border and more than 200 miles southwest of the nearest established grizzly population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The camera had been set by a rancher monitoring livestock movement. He had not been thinking about grizzly bears. Nobody in that part of Idaho had been thinking about grizzly bears. The nearest confirmed grizzly habitat, the territory that wildlife biologists designate as the recovery zone, where the species is known to exist in sustainable numbers, was in the mountains of the Selkirk and Cabinet Ranges to the north and the wild country around Yellowstone to the east. Gem County, Idaho, is not mountains. It is river bottomland and irrigated farmland and small towns. It is the western lowlands, the flat agricultural interior of a state that most people picture as rugged and vertical. A grizzly bear in Gem County, Idaho, is not like a grizzly bear photographed slightly outside the boundary of a mapped recovery zone. It is like a grizzly bear appearing in a landscape where the concept of a grizzly bear had not been part of anyone's thinking for well over a century. The photograph circulated through the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, through the interagency grizzly bear committees that coordinate management across the Northern Rockies ecosystem. It was verified. The hair samples collected from a fence the animal had passed under were analyzed. The DNA confirmed what the photograph had already shown. A grizzly bear had been camera-confirmed in the western lowlands of Idaho at a location that placed it outside what wildlife managers use as the operational boundaries of known grizzly range by a distance of approximately 200 miles. This was not a bear that had wandered a few miles downslope from established habitat. This was a bear that had crossed a landscape of highways and farms and populated river valleys and small cities, and appeared, confirmed on camera, in a place where grizzly bears are not supposed to be. If you are the kind of person who watches videos about wildlife and wild country and the things happening at the edges of what the maps tell us, subscribe before we go further. What gets documented in this space tends to be the kind of story that doesn't get told clearly anywhere else, and this is one of those stories. The response from wildlife agencies was measured. The official communications used language calibrated to reassure rather than alarm. A single confirmed sighting of a single animal does not indicate a population shift. Dispersing grizzly bears have always made exploratory movements beyond the core of their established range. The bear was not believed to represent a threat to public safety in any immediate sense. All of that is true, and all of it is relevant, and none of it comes close to capturing the full meaning of what that photograph represents. A grizzly bear 200 miles outside its known range in the agricultural lowlands of western Idaho is not just a wildlife curiosity. It is evidence of something happening in the grizzly bear's relationship to the American landscape that the maps and the management frameworks and the recovery plans have not yet fully processed. And the gap between what the maps say and what that trail camera showed is where the real story begins. To understand why the Gem County photograph matters, you have to understand what grizzly bears were, what happened to them, and what has been happening since. The grizzly bear, Ursus arctos horribilis, was not originally a mountain animal. That is the first and most important piece of context, and it is the piece that most people who have any image of grizzly bears in their head from nature documentaries and national park footage have absorbed exactly backwards. The grizzly bear that exists in the collective imagination is a creature of high mountain wilderness, of glacial peaks and old-growth forest, of remote backcountry accessible only to the serious outdoorsman. That image is historically accurate for the last 150 years. It is historically inaccurate for the 150,000 years before that. The grizzly bear evolved on open ground. Its ancestors crossed the land bridge from Asia during the Pleistocene and spread across the North American interior in an environment of open grasslands, river bottoms, and prairie, the kind of terrain where the enormous muscular shoulder hump that gives the grizzly its most distinctive profile serves its actual evolutionary purpose, which is powering the four-leg excavation used to dig roots, ground squirrels, and bison calves from hard ground on the open plains. When Europeans arrived in North America, in numbers sufficient to begin keeping records, grizzly bears ranged across an estimated 2 million square miles of the continent's interior. They were present on the Great Plains of the central United States, in densities that early explorers found remarkable and frequently terrifying. The Lewis and Clark expeditions' journals contain more entries about grizzly bear encounters than about almost any other wildlife species, and those entries are not describing remote mountain encounters. They are describing bears on the banks of the Missouri River, bears on open grassland, bears in river bottoms choked with cottonwood and willow, bears in the kind of terrain that is now farmland, and small cities and irrigation canals in states like Idaho and Montana and the Dakotas. The grizzly bear of the historical record was an animal of the lowland West as much as the mountain West. It lived where the food was abundant and the ground was workable, and those places were not primarily the high country. They were the valleys and the plains and the riparian corridors. What happened to the grizzly bear between 1800 and 1975 is one of the most consequential and least discussed episodes in the history of North American wildlife. The bear was not pushed out of its lowland range by habitat loss in the way that, for example, wetland birds lost habitat to drainage. It was killed. It was killed systematically, deliberately, and with the explicit intention of eliminating the species from landscapes that were being converted to agricultural use. Ranchers killed it because it took cattle and sheep. Farmers killed it because it was dangerous, and because the culture of the frontier viewed the grizzly as an obstacle to civilization, in the most literal sense. The federal government killed it through the Bureau of Biological Survey's predator control programs, which employed professional hunters and trappers and poison campaigns to eliminate grizzly bears, along with wolves and mountain lions, from the range livestock states of the West. The hunting pressure from sport hunters who traveled to the frontier specifically for grizzly bear trophies added additional mortality. The poisoning programs added more. By the early 20th century, the grizzly bear had been extirpated from the Great Plains entirely. By mid-century, it had been pushed out of virtually every lowland habitat in the contiguous United States. The bears that survived did so in the high country, in the remote mountain ranges of the northern Rockies and the wilderness around Yellowstone, not because those were their preferred habitats, but because those were the habitats most difficult for humans to reach, and therefore the places where the killing pressure was lowest. The mountain grizzly bear is not the ancestral grizzly bear. It is a survivor's version, a remnant population occupying a refuge habitat because every other habitat had been rendered lethal. By 1975, when the grizzly bear was listed as threatened under the newly enacted Endangered Species Act, the species had been reduced in the contiguous United States to approximately 1,000 animals, occupying 6 discrete and isolated populations. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem held the largest population. The Northern Continental Divide ecosystem in northwestern Montana held the second largest. The Selkirk and Cabinet Yaak ecosystems in northern Idaho and adjacent Montana held small, fragile populations in the dozens. The North Cascades population in Washington had been reduced to a handful of animals and has since been confirmed as functionally extirpated. with no confirmed sightings of reproductive females in decades. The Bitterroot ecosystem in central Idaho, which the recovery plan had designated as a potential reintroduction zone, had no confirmed resident bears. The total range of the grizzly in the lower 48 states had been reduced from 2 million square miles to approximately 30,000. It had been reduced not by natural process, but by human decision, executed with tools and poisons and rifles and federal funding over a period of roughly 150 years. The recovery process that followed the 1975 listing was slow, contested, and scientifically complex in ways that the public discussion of grizzly bears has rarely captured accurately. The Endangered Species Act required the development of recovery plans with numerical targets for population size and distribution. The interagency grizzly bear study team that was assembled to monitor the Yellowstone population pioneered mark recapture methodologies and telemetry-based monitoring that produced the first genuinely reliable population estimates for a grizzly population in the lower 48. The numbers that came back in the early years of monitoring were sobering. The Yellowstone population in the late 1970s was estimated at fewer than 300 animals. Mortality from poaching, from management removals of problem bears, from livestock conflicts, and from collisions with vehicles was running at rates that population models suggested were above the level the population could sustain in the long term. The species was not just threatened in a bureaucratic sense. It was on a trajectory toward local extinction in every population where it still existed. The recovery that has occurred since is one of the genuine conservation successes of the Endangered Species Act era, and it deserves to be described accurately and without the political freight that discussions of grizzly bear management tend to accumulate quickly. The Yellowstone population grew. It grew steadily, from below 300 animals in the late 1970s to an estimated 700 to 1,000 animals by the mid-2020s, depending on the methodology used and the boundaries of the count. Bears began appearing at the margins of the ecosystem, in places where they had not been documented for decades. They moved into the Absaroka Range on the eastern edge of the ecosystem, into the Beartooth Plateau, south along the Wyoming Range, north toward the Wind River Range. The population's distribution was expanding as its density within the core habitat increased, and young animals, particularly young males, began dispersing outward in search of unoccupied territory. The Northern Continental Divide population around Glacier National Park followed a similar trajectory. Bears began appearing in terrain between the two large populations, in the mountains of central Montana, in places that raised, for the first time in a century, the question of whether the two populations might eventually exchange animals across the landscape that separates them. This is the ecological backdrop against which the Gem County, Idaho, trail camera image has to be understood. A grizzly bear population that was reduced to a few hundred animals in a small patch of high mountain wilderness has, over the course of roughly 4 decades of protection and managed recovery, grown to a point where individual animals are consistently appearing at locations 200 miles, 300 miles, in some cases, even further from the nearest established population core. These are dispersing animals. They are almost always young males, the demographic that bears the full cost of population expansion. The animals pushed outward by competitive pressure from established adults holding the best territories in the core areas. Wandering into unfamiliar terrain without established home ranges or knowledge of the landscape, covering distances that reflect both the remarkable physical capability of grizzly bears and the reality that the habitats they are moving through are not the impassable barriers they appear to be on a map designed for human navigation. The Gem County bear, whatever its origin and whatever became of it after the camera captured it, was an animal that had crossed somewhere between 100 and 200 miles of terrain between established grizzly habitat and the irrigation canal where it was photographed. That terrain includes mountain ranges, river valleys, highways, agricultural fields, small towns, and populated river corridors. It includes the Boise metropolitan area within striking distance. It includes the Snake River Plain, one of the most heavily modified agricultural landscapes in the American West. The bear crossed all of it, or some substantial portion of it, without being detected until that single trail camera frame. Nobody saw it. Nobody reported it. Nobody knew it was there. It moved through a landscape that humans have occupied densely for a century and a half and remained invisible until a camera positioned for an entirely different purpose caught it at 3 in the morning. That invisibility is significant, and it is the first thing that the trail camera image should force a reassessment of. The standard assumption in discussions of large carnivore presence is that if a grizzly bear were in your county, you would know. Ranchers would report livestock kills. Hikers would have sightings. Evidence of digging and foraging would be found. Tracks would be identified along stream banks. The reality, increasingly documented across multiple large carnivore species and multiple geographic contexts, is that large carnivores are dramatically better at moving through human-occupied landscapes without detection than the human assumption of comprehensive surveillance would suggest. Mountain lion research in California has demonstrated that individual mountain lions can spend years in suburban canyon systems, conducting hunts and moving through developed terrain at night without producing a single confirmed human sighting. Wolf recolonization of California, which was not confirmed until 2011 when a GPS-collared animal designated OR7 crossed from Oregon, happened years after wolves had likely already been present in the state at various times without being detected or reported credibly enough to generate official confirmation. The trail camera has been one of the most significant tools for closing the gap between what humans assume they know about wildlife presence and what is actually happening in the landscape, because it does not require a human observer to be in the right place at the right time. It simply records what passes in front of it, and what passes in front of trail cameras in the American West increasingly includes animals that the maps say should not be there. The question of what the Gem County grizzly was doing and where it came from has been the subject of significant interest among wildlife biologists and rather less public discussion than the event warranted. The DNA analysis conducted on the hair samples collected at the site allowed the bear to be assigned to a population of origin with reasonable confidence. The genetic profile matched bears from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This is ecologically significant because it tells you something about the direction of the movement. A young male bear from the Yellowstone population, following the gradient of suitable habitat and low human conflict, could have moved westward across southern Idaho's mountains, through the breaks of the Snake River drainage, and eventually into the lowland terrain of the western Boise area. The route is not obvious on a road map. It is not obvious even on a topographic map. But bears do not read maps, and they do not follow roads. They follow food, water, cover, and the absence of concentrated human disturbance, and the route that connects Yellowstone country to the western Idaho lowlands, while circuitous and demanding, is not impossible. It is apparently passable. The Gem County photograph is evidence that it has been passed. Grizzly bear recovery in the lower 48 states has always been a process with two distinct phases, and the difference between them matters enormously for what the Gem County sighting represents. The first phase is population stabilization and growth within existing refuge habitats. This is the phase that most of the public attention and most of the management resources have been focused on for the past 40 years, and it is the phase that has been most successful in measurable terms. The Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide populations have grown substantially. The Selkirk and Cabinet Yaak populations have been supplemented with translocated animals, and their trajectories have improved, though both remain small and fragile. The second phase, which the recovery plan envisions, but which has been far more controversial and far less successfully implemented, is the reconnection of isolated populations across the intervening landscape and the eventual restoration of grizzly bears to a portion of their historical range that extends beyond the existing recovery zones. This second phase requires bears to move through terrain that has been occupied by humans and managed for human land uses for over a century. It requires grizzly bears to re-enter landscapes where they were deliberately extirpated and where the human communities now present had no living institutional memory of sharing space with the species. The controversy around this second phase is intense and is not reducible to simple categories of environmentalists versus ranchers, though the conflict often gets framed that way in media coverage. The concerns of livestock operators in areas where grizzly bears might expand are not irrational. The grizzly bear's historical relationship with range livestock is not good. Grizzly bears are intelligent, opportunistic, and remarkably capable of learning to exploit new food sources. A grizzly bear that discovers that domestic sheep are easier to kill than elk will return to that food source with the kind of behavioral persistence that makes them very difficult to deter, short of lethal action. The livestock depredation conflicts in the areas of grizzly presence in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho are not hypothetical problems being inflated for political effect. They are documented ongoing conflicts with real economic consequences for the families and operations that experience them. And they are taking place in the existing recovery zones, not in the lowland agricultural terrain that a westward expanding Yellowstone population would need to pass through or establish itself in. What a grizzly bear that establishes itself in the western Idaho lowlands, in the farms and ranches of the Treasure Valley and the Boise River corridor, would mean for livestock operators in that landscape is not a question that anyone in the official management framework is eager to answer directly, because the honest answer is complicated and the political consequences of that complication are significant. The Endangered Species Act creates a specific legal situation around any confirmed grizzly bear presence that has direct practical consequences for landowners and land managers in areas where bears appear. Grizzly bears remain listed as threatened across the contiguous United States, which means that harming or killing one outside of very specific, narrowly defined circumstances is a federal crime with significant penalties. For a rancher whose sheep have been killed by a grizzly bear, the legal framework within which he or she can respond to the ongoing threat is considerably more constrained than the legal framework available for dealing with coyotes or mountain lions or other predators that are not under federal protection. The management agencies can conduct lethal removals of grizzly bears that have demonstrated a pattern of livestock depredation or that pose an imminent threat to human safety. But those removals require a documented incident, an agency response process, and often a political process that can move slowly relative to the pace at which a depredating bear can cause economic damage. The Gem County sighting, if it had been followed by livestock conflicts in that area, would have placed livestock operators in Gem County inside a legal and management framework that they had had no reason to prepare for and no historical experience navigating. The bear apparently moved on. The next one may not. The human safety dimension of the Gem County sighting and what it represents is the dimension that received the least public discussion, and the one that most directly parallels the dynamics visible in the mountain lion data. Grizzly bear attacks on humans are statistically rare. The documented record of fatal grizzly bear attacks in the lower 48 states over the past century is a number that can be counted in the dozens. The record within the national parks, where the majority of human grizzly encounters occur, because that is where the highest concentration of humans and grizzly bears share the same landscape, shows a pattern of attack incidents that has increased as the Yellowstone population has grown and as the overlap between bears and backcountry recreationists has intensified. The increase is real, and it is documented in the Yellowstone research record. It is still a small absolute number. Grizzly bears are not a reliable mechanism for dying in the American West. But the direction of the trend, as with mountain lions, points toward increasing rather than decreasing frequency. And the increasing frequency is occurring against a backdrop of a growing population, moving into new terrain, where the humans present have no experience with the species and have not developed the behavioral protocols and situational awareness that reduce encounter risk. A hiker in Yellowstone in 2024 who has been visiting the park for 20 years has a body of experiential knowledge about grizzly bear country. They know to make noise on trails. They know to travel in groups. They know what bear sign looks like and what to do when they find it fresh. They carry bear spray. They know the areas of high bear activity and the times of year when those areas produce the greatest concentration of bears and hikers simultaneously. They have probably read the park's bear encounter protocols, and they have the cultural context to take them seriously, because they know that the bears in this landscape are real and present and capable. A farmer in Gem County, Idaho, who has lived there for 30 years, has none of that knowledge, none of that context, and no cultural framework for integrating the possibility of a grizzly bear encounter into their daily life. If grizzly bears begin establishing themselves in the western Idaho lowlands, the population that will be encountering them is not the experienced backcountry community that operates in the existing recovery zones. It will be people checking irrigation pivots at dusk, kids walking along the river, farmers moving through their own fields in the early morning. The behavioral and informational gap between those two populations is enormous, and the consequences of that gap in a bear encounter context are potentially serious. Bear spray is the most effective non-lethal tool for reducing the severity of grizzly bear attacks on humans. The research documenting its efficacy is extensive and unambiguous. When used correctly in a genuine grizzly bear encounter, bear spray has a documented success rate at stopping attacks that exceeds the success rate of firearms, which sounds counterintuitive, and which the research supports with sufficient rigor that it has become the official recommendation of wildlife agencies across the range. The problem with bear spray as a safety solution for a newly bear-occupied landscape is exactly the same problem that bear spray presents in any context where the population being asked to use it does not have prior experience with bears. You have to have it. It has to be accessible, not in a pack, but on your body. You have to know how to deploy it under the specific conditions of a grizzly bear charge, which include high levels of adrenaline, very little time, and the specific biomechanics of pointing a canister at an approaching animal and deploying the spray at the right distance. These things are skills. They are learnable skills, but they require deliberate preparation and practice that the agricultural communities of the western Idaho lowlands have had no reason to acquire and will not acquire spontaneously in response to a single verified trail camera photograph. The management challenge that the Gem County sighting represents is therefore not just about what to do about one bear, or even about the prospect of more bears using the same dispersal route. It is about a much larger institutional and community preparation question that wildlife agencies are structurally poorly positioned to address quickly. The Endangered Species Act's recovery planning framework is designed to manage species recovery within designated recovery zones. It is not designed to manage the public communication, community preparedness, and land use coordination challenges of a recovering species moving into new terrain outside those zones. The interagency grizzly bear committees that coordinate management across the Northern Rockies do not have jurisdictional standing or operational resources in Gem County, Idaho, in any meaningful sense. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game has regulatory authority over wildlife management in the state, but limited authority over a federally threatened species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maintains federal oversight, but is not a local presence in the Treasure Valley in any form that would allow rapid community engagement. The institutional response to a grizzly bear in Gem County is necessarily slow, fragmented, and dependent on interagency coordination processes that were designed for a different problem than the one the trail camera photograph presents. The question of whether the Gem County sighting represents a genuine trend or an isolated anomaly is one that cannot be resolved from a single data point. And yet the management and community preparation decisions that need to be made do not wait for the data to accumulate to statistical significance. This is a recurring problem in conservation biology and in wildlife management more broadly. The events that require management decisions are, by definition, things that have not happened often enough to generate the sample size needed for confident statistical inference. The first confirmed grizzly bear in Gem County, Idaho, is the first confirmed grizzly bear in Gem County, Idaho. Whether it is a one-time dispersal event or the leading edge of a genuine range expansion cannot be determined from the photograph, the hair samples, or the DNA analysis. It can only be determined by what happens in the years that follow, by whether other bears appear on trail cameras in the same region, by whether bears establish home ranges rather than moving through, by whether females, the demographic whose presence is definitive for actual population establishment, are documented in the lowland landscape. A dispersing male moves through terrain. A female with cubs establishes territory. The distinction between those two scenarios is the distinction between a biological curiosity and a genuine range expansion, and it is a distinction that the trail camera data, accumulated over years, will eventually make clear. The decisions about how to prepare communities and manage landscapes cannot wait that long. There is a longer history behind this kind of event that wildlife biologists and conservation historians are better positioned to appreciate than the general public. And it is a history worth laying out because it provides essential context for the meaning of what is happening now. Large carnivore recovery in North America has a pattern. The pattern is not uniform across species, but it has enough consistent features to be identifiable. The pattern begins with population collapse, which occurred for grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions, and black bears across the American West and Southeast between roughly 1850 and 1950 through a combination of direct killing, habitat loss, and prey depletion. The pattern continues with legal protection and management intervention, which occurred for grizzly bears with the 1975 ESA listing, for wolves with the 1974 listing and the subsequent reintroduction programs, for mountain lions with the hunting regulations reforms of the 1960s and 1970s. The pattern then enters a phase of population growth within core protected areas. And then, when the protected areas reach or approach their carrying capacity, the pattern enters a phase of dispersal and range expansion that is not something wildlife managers initiate or control. It is something wildlife managers respond to, after the fact, when animals appear in places the maps did not predict. The wolf recolonization of the American West is the most extensively documented version of this pattern, and it offers the most direct precedent for thinking about what grizzly bear range expansion means in practical terms. Wolves recolonized Montana's Bob Marshall Wilderness from Canadian source populations beginning in the mid-1980s, before any formal reintroduction program existed. The Yellowstone and Central Idaho reintroductions of 1995 and 1996 introduced animals that established populations which grew rapidly and dispersed widely. By 2011, wolves had been confirmed in California. By 2017, Oregon had a confirmed breeding pack in the Coast Range, far outside the northeastern corner of the state, where wolves had first recolonized. By the early 2020s, wolves were being documented in Colorado, in Washington's western lowlands, in areas of the Great Plains where no living person had ever seen a wild wolf. Each of these confirmations followed the same basic pattern as the Gem County grizzly. A trail camera, or a carcass, or a GPS-collared animal captured the confirmation. Wildlife agencies issued measured statements about dispersal behavior and the rarity of the observation. Community responses ranged from excitement in places with strong conservation cultures to fear and anger in livestock communities. And in every case, the question of whether the observation represented a trend or an anomaly was asked and could not be definitively answered from the single data point. And the trend became apparent only as more data accumulated over time. The wolves that recolonized the Pacific Northwest encountered a landscape that had not had wolves for roughly 70 years. The deer and elk populations in that landscape had been managed without a top predator for 3 generations. The livestock operations had been designed and operated without the threat management practices that wolf country historically required. The cultural knowledge about wolf behavior and wolf-human coexistence that had existed in communities that shared landscapes with wolves prior to extirpation was gone. The recolonization was ecologically successful in ways that cascade through trophic levels and that wildlife biologists find deeply significant. It was also socially and politically contentious in ways that have produced ongoing conflict between conservation interests and agricultural interests that has not been fully resolved more than 30 years after the first animals returned. The grizzly bear recovery that is now producing dispersals, like the Gem County sighting, will follow a similar trajectory, and the conflicts it produces will share the same basic structure, while differing in important ways that reflect the specific characteristics of grizzly bears relative to wolves. Grizzly bears are not wolves. The comparison is useful for understanding the institutional dynamics of large carnivore recovery, but it breaks down at the biological level in ways that matter significantly for land managers and rural communities. A wolf in agricultural terrain is a threat primarily to livestock, specifically to sheep and cattle that are accessible and unguarded. A wolf almost never poses a direct threat to adult humans, and poses a minimal documented threat even to children. The fear of wolf attacks in North American communities with wolf presence is largely cultural, rather than empirically grounded, though it has real political consequences regardless of its empirical basis. A grizzly bear in agricultural terrain is a threat to livestock and potentially to people in ways that are not analogous to wolf risk. Grizzly bears are large. An adult male grizzly in good condition weighs 400 to 600 pounds and generates enough force in its forelimbs to move boulders and dismantle structures built by humans for other purposes. A grizzly bear that discovers a chicken coop or a sheep pen does not simply take an animal and leave. It often destroys the structure in the process. A grizzly bear that becomes food-conditioned in an agricultural landscape, that has learned to associate human structures and activity with accessible calories, represents a qualitatively different kind of conflict than a food-conditioned wolf in the same landscape. The scale of the animal, its physical capability, and the direct physical risk it poses to any human who encounters it in a conflict context are features that place grizzly-human conflict in a different risk category than wolf-human conflict, even though the absolute numbers of human injuries from each species show different patterns than cultural anxiety would predict. The food conditioning pathway is the mechanism through which most serious grizzly bear conflicts with humans develop, and it is worth understanding precisely because it operates through human behavior as much as bear behavior. A grizzly bear is an omnivore with a digestive system and a behavioral repertoire designed to exploit a wide range of caloric sources. In its mountain habitat, it eats whitebark pine nuts, huckleberries, army cutworm moths, elk calves, bison calves, carrion, roots, ground squirrels, and whatever else the seasonal calendar makes available. Its foraging strategy is broad and opportunistic, and it is capable of very rapid behavioral learning about new food sources. A grizzly bear that reaches a garbage dump, an unsecured dumpster behind a restaurant, a compost pile adjacent to a rural residence, a field where a dead livestock animal has been left, has discovered a caloric resource that requires far less energy expenditure than anything its natural diet provides. The bear will return. It will bring that specific location into its foraging route, and each successful return visit produces reinforcement of the association between human-occupied terrain and accessible calories. The food-conditioned bear is not a fundamentally different animal from the wild foraging bear. It is the same animal that has incorporated a new category of food source into its behavioral repertoire through the same learning mechanisms it uses to learn anything else. The resulting behavior, however, is incompatible with safe coexistence between grizzly bears and human communities, because a food-conditioned grizzly bear that loses its wariness of human structures and human presence is an animal that will eventually be in close proximity to people in contexts where the risk of a conflict injury is high. The communities most likely to create food conditioning opportunities for a dispersing grizzly bear are not the wilderness gateway towns that exist at the edges of established recovery zones and that have, over decades of bear presence and management pressure, developed reasonably bear-aware cultures and reasonably bear-resistant infrastructure. They are the communities that have never had grizzly bears and therefore have had no reason to manage attractants, secure garbage, think about compost, or consider what a livestock carcass left in a field represents to a passing bear. The western Idaho agricultural communities that would be the first human settlements a Yellowstone origin disperser encounters are precisely this kind of community. They are not careless or irresponsible. They are simply operating in a landscape that has not required bear-aware practices for over 100 years, and the institutional mechanisms for rapidly changing community practices in response to a new wildlife presence are not well developed anywhere in the American wildlife management framework. The grizzly bear's relationship to the Idaho landscape is not entirely a story of absence. The Selkirk ecosystem in the far north of the Panhandle, the narrow strip of Idaho that runs between Washington and Montana toward the Canadian border, has a confirmed resident grizzly bear population. It is small. The last reliable estimates put it at fewer than 100 animals, and some population models suggest the actual number is lower. This population is connected to a larger Canadian population across the international border, and that connectivity is one of the reasons it has not yet followed the apparent trajectory of the North Cascades population toward functional extinction. The bears of the Selkirk ecosystem are real and documented, and they produce the kinds of human conflicts that the Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide populations produce: livestock depredation events, encounters with backcountry recreationists, management removals of problem animals. But they are confined to terrain that looks like what most people imagine when they imagine grizzly bear country: mountain forest, remote river drainages, wilderness areas, and national forest land. The Gem County sighting was not this. It was the Selkirk grizzly, in no meaningful sense. It was something else, something that came from a different direction and appeared in a different kind of landscape. And that distinction is what makes it significant beyond the novelty of the conformation. The politics of grizzly bear recovery in the lower 48 states have been conducted at high temperature for decades and are worth laying out honestly because they shape the institutional context within which the Gem County sighting is being processed. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has attempted to delist the Greater Yellowstone and Northern Continental Divide grizzly populations from threatened status on two separate occasions, in 2007 and 2017, arguing that both populations had met the numerical and distributional recovery targets established in the original recovery plans. Both attempts were successfully challenged in federal court by conservation organizations, which argued that the recovery plan targets were insufficient metrics for a genuinely recovered population, and that delisting would remove federal protections in the absence of adequate state management plans that guaranteed long-term population viability. The courts agreed, on different legal grounds in each case. The bears remain listed, The management authority for grizzly bears outside national parks therefore remains with the federal government rather than the states, which has significant implications for how a dispersing bear in western Idaho is managed and what options are available to state and local agencies when conflicts arise. The state of Idaho has a complicated relationship with large carnivore recovery. The state government opposed wolf reintroduction in the 1990s and has consistently pushed for maximum state management authority over predators, including grizzly bears, in part because the state's agricultural and hunting constituencies view federal predator protection as an imposition on land uses and wildlife management approaches that they believe should be determined by the state rather than by federal law and federal courts. This political posture is not simply hostility to wildlife. It reflects a genuine disagreement about the appropriate balance between species conservation and the interests of rural communities that bear the economic costs of large predator presence without receiving proportionate economic benefits. The grizzly bear's recovery, like the wolf's recovery, has distributed costs and benefits unequally across the landscape, with rural livestock operations bearing most of the direct economic costs and with urban and suburban populations who bear essentially no direct costs, representing the majority of the political constituency for continued federal protection. That inequality is real, and it generates resentment that is not always acknowledged clearly in conservation advocacy communications. The wildlife crossing dimension of grizzly bear recovery is perhaps the most concrete and most underappreciated element of the long-term picture. Grizzly bears, like mountain lions and wolves, move across landscapes in ways that require passable corridors through terrain that human development has fragmented. The Interstate 90 corridor through northern Idaho and western Montana, where Selkirk and Cabinet Yaak bears theoretically could exchange animals with each other and with Canadian populations, is a significant barrier to movement. The Highway 2 corridor along the southern edge of Glacier National Park presents similar challenges. The Snake River Plain Highway network that a Yellowstone origin disperser would have needed to navigate to reach Gem County represents a gauntlet of traffic mortality risk that filters the population of animals capable of completing the movement to those lucky enough or skilled enough to cross without being killed. The mortality of dispersing grizzly bears in road crossing attempts is not as well documented as mountain lion road mortality in Southern California, because the events are rarer and the terrain is more remote. But the basic physics of a large animal crossing a high-speed highway at night are the same regardless of species. Wildlife crossing infrastructure of the scale needed to meaningfully reconnect grizzly bear populations across the Idaho landscape does not exist. There is no plan for it to exist. The advocacy community that has successfully pushed for wildlife crossings in places like the Santa Monica Mountains and along the I-70 corridor in Colorado has not yet focused on the crossings that would allow grizzly bears to move across the Snake River Plain in safety. The ecological significance of what the Gem County photograph documents, stripped of its political and management complexity, is worth pausing on because it is genuinely remarkable and because it tends to get lost in the administrative and political discussion. A species that was systematically driven to near extinction in the lower 48 states over the course of a century and a half, that was reduced to a few isolated refugia in high mountain wilderness, that was managed back from the edge of functional extinction in those refugia through decades of legal protection and careful population management, is now producing individual animals that are moving across hundreds of miles of human-dominated landscape and appearing in places that have not had the species for a century. This is what conservation success looks like when it actually works. The Gem County grizzly is not a problem to be managed. It is evidence of a recovery process functioning as recovery processes are supposed to function, producing animals in sufficient numbers and with sufficient vitality to push into new terrain. The recovery planners who sat in offices in the 1970s and 1980s and designed the frameworks that led to this moment were hoping for exactly this outcome. The fact that the outcome is complicated and difficult to manage is not an argument against having pursued it. It is simply a description of what large-scale ecological restoration looks like at the stage where the animals begin making decisions that the managers did not anticipate. What needs to happen in response to the Gem County sighting and to the broader pattern it represents is not a single action. It is a series of parallel processes that need to run simultaneously, and that wildlife agencies, state governments, federal agencies, local communities, and the conservation community all have specific and different roles in. The monitoring infrastructure needs to expand. The trail camera networks that currently exist in established recovery zones are not designed to detect dispersing animals in the lowland terrain of western Idaho. Expanding systematic camera monitoring in the corridors that connect Yellowstone origin habitat to the western lowlands. In the river drainages and mountain passes that a dispersing bear would logically use, would provide the data needed to distinguish between an isolated event and an emerging pattern, much faster than waiting for the next incidental camera confirmation. The community preparedness conversations need to begin before the next bear is confirmed. The agricultural communities in the Gem County area, in the broader Treasure Valley, in the Boise River corridor, need access to information about bear-aware practices, attractant management, and encounter protocols from agencies that currently have no formal engagement with those communities on this topic. The political process around Grizzly Bear Management Authority and the conditions under which state management plans might satisfy the legal standards for delisting needs to advance, because the current situation, in which federal protection applies in full force to a dispersing animal in western Idaho agricultural terrain, while providing no meaningful management tools to local agencies, is not a stable long-term